Donald Trump, Rodrigo Duterte, they have been described as populists. But what makes a politician or statesman a populist? What are the underpinnings of populist politics? These are concepts that I think are used as catchphrases or sometimes cliches in journalistic headlines. But we have to better understand what populism really means. And in the case of the United States, what kind of populism, if ever, are we going to see under a second version of the Trump presidency? Are countries like Hungary, for instance, under Viktor Orban, a potential model for conservatives and the MAGA movement in the United States? And more importantly, for us in the Philippines, can populism, the Duterte version, make a comeback next year in the midterm elections? What is the lay of the land for midterm elections in the Philippines? And what about in 2028? Could the Dutertes or some version of the Dutertes make a comeback, just like in the United States? Thank you very much for joining us. Beautiful, beautiful. There's a lot to discuss. As you can guess, we're going to discuss about populism, the return of Donald Trump, some would say the greatest return, but I suspect that won't be the only populist comeback. We have had a lot of that in the past with Silvio Berlusconi in Italy. We have seen the resilience of certain populist dynasties from Fujimoris, and I can go on with many examples all around the world. And in the Philippines, obviously, we'll have to talk about the Dutertes as we discuss the midterm elections later on. But before that, can we first really deconstruct, or at least break down, what is really populism all about? Is it a style? Is it a mobilization tactic? Is it a way of, a philosophy of governance, or all of the above? What is your understanding? And the reason I want to talk to you more than perhaps anyone else nowadays is because the model of Hungary under Viktor Orban is being invoked a lot as a potential model for Donald Trump. What could a kind of a conservative populism in the 21st century look like?
Yeah, and now I'm reminded that half of the time, half of my stay in Budapest, I spent it protesting because Orban was trying to kick out our university. In fact, successfully did kick out the Central European University. I think there are competing schools of thought on what populism is, no? But I think to simply break it down, I think there are two general schools of thought on what populism is. One is that what you've described kanina, it's more of a style, it's more of a rhetoric, no? So this is, for example, the bad manners of Duterte and Trump, diba? Medyo the use of incendiary language. But what unites them, rather than the use of bad language, for example, or polarizing tones, would be this idea that they always paint a part of the population, whether real or imaginary, as sort of the enemy of the people, right? So in the case of Digong, that's the Dilawan, that's the liberal elites. That's also supposedly those who are involved in whether using illegal drugs, the trade, no pushers, no etc. No.
So it's amorphous. It's quite amorphous, right? Oligarchs,
Yes.
Dilawan, Drugista, and they kind of put them all together.
Yeah,
right?
and it's that's a very actually essential part of what that discourse is like. It's empty. It's always imagined. The enemy is always imagined, and it's replaced from immigrants to something else. No, from one country to another. But basically, at least it portrays that the society, the good people, is in opposition with a particular set of evil enemies, evil elites, no, whatever that population is targeted. But the other school of thought has something more to do that, yes, rhetoric is important, yes, the style is important, but at its core, populism is a mobilization strategy. It's a specific way of gaining the support of voters and winning power, no? So, halimbawa, in Philippines, we're quite used to politicians using what we call election machines, right? Through patronage, right? You distribute money, you spend a lot in campaign ads, no, but also campaign on the ground, right? But this is very costly, and usually it takes mainstream politicians.
Right.
It requires that you're kind of like part of the dominant social circle, right? And this is why populism is quite attractive to outsiders, no? Essentially, when Trump started, he was sort of like an outsider in mainstream U.S. politics, no? Just like Duterte, in a way, he wasn't really part of that national political stage. No? Kaya nga, many were surprised what happened in 2016. So idea is that rather than going through the usual means of courting voters, you use media, you use direct appeal to the voters. No? So it's like a cheap, it's like a cost-effective way of mobilizing voters. No? So you kind of like interrupt these established means of ways of mobilizing support, no, and use more direct appeal to mobilize voters. So I think those
And they're
generally are the
disruptors, right? I mean, disruption is the name of the game. If you want to be for free in the headlines, you say crazy stuff,
Yes,
right? I mean,
yes.
that's the cheapest way of heading in
Yes,
the headlines.
yes.
So it's part of the modus operandi.
Yeah, if you don't want to pay for TV ads, but you always want to be present in the media, the best way to do is of course to catch the attention of the media. No? So you say, for example, that papatayin ko lahat ng mga drug addict, and apparently that's what he did, right?
Yeah.
But even crazy things like, di ba, na
Build the wall.
di ba, o kaya I will deport everyone, or
Yeah.
etong recent na policy promise ni Trump is that he will disestablish the entire U.S. Department of
state.
Education,
Oh,
for
yeah.
example,
Oh,
di ba?
wow. Yeah.
That kind of promise, those kinds of things, when you say those things, di ba, you technically dominate the airwaves now.
Right.
And then you don't have to spend for it, right?
So you have to be quite far out there in order to make sure. So disruption is the name of the game. They're kind of influencers in that way, right? Going back to this, I want to talk about the case of Hungary because it's a fascinating case of it's a successful model of economic transition. It's one of the fastest growing economies next to Poland. We had the foreign minister of Poland also on this show talking about the miracle, the Polish miracle. But Hungary is another very successful case. And Viktor Orban is someone who was a liberal activist back in the day, right? So like he ticks all the boxes of this transformative phenomenon or moment in Eastern European, Central European history. And yet you have an EU member which is actively moving in a direction that does not necessarily reflect your understanding of what EU is all about. I mean, it doesn't look like Hungary has been moving in the direction of modernization, aka becoming more like France or UK or Sweden for that matter. And yet it's still a successful country economically. It's politically very strongly mobilized. It punches a lot. It carries a lot of weight internationally. The MAGA influencers are big fans of Viktor Orban. He gave a speech at one of the big conservative events in the U.S. So, first of all, what is your understanding of the Hungarian case of Viktor Orban? How did he pull it off? And he's been in power for such a long time, successfully.
So in many ways, he shares similarities with the background of Duterte.
Yeah.
Like Duterte entered politics at a time of democratic transition, right? We were transitioning from the Marcos dictatorship, and because they were part of at least yung mom ni Digong was part of the anti-dictatorship movement, he benefited from that, and he got appointed and eventually, dominated local politics. So as you've said, Viktor Orban also used to be part of those who benefited from the transition to democracy,
From communism, Soviet Union.
From
yeah.
Soviet communism. And he was part of that liberal democratic circles, advocating for these transitions. But like Duterte, it has come to a point that the democratic transition has been quite disappointing, especially when it comes to measures of shared prosperity, halimbawa. So in the sense that after years of democratic transition, the promise is that, of course, Hungarians will benefit from this. They will feel the economic prosperity. But, inequality worsened, and then there's a lot of corruption among elite politicians. So there was a point that in Hungary, this liberal and kind of like socialist coalition has dominated mainstream politics to the point that it's like there's a party cartel, diba?
Right.
It's just them, And I think a lot when you go back to 2016, 2015, there was also the feeling, diba, na liberal party, and this is the perception, whether real or not. The perception of the people is that the democratic transition was quite disappointing. There's a lot
co-opted by cabal.
Yes, there's a lot of misgovernance, and the liberal elites failed to deliver, right? So he also rode on that wave, And by riding on that wave, actually, Viktor Orban shifted into right, and he took on very nationalist themes, no,
Right.
of making, for example, one of the biggest mobilizing narratives of Orban and his party Fidesz, for example, is the claim that Hungary must return to the greater Hungary.
Yeah.
Much like the
Make
Make
America
America
great
Great Again, right?
That's his MAGA.
Yeah.
A Magyar MAGA, right? Yeah, yeah.
Because supposedly that Hungary has lost control of its own country, and now the supposed evil enemy is no longer the Soviet Union but the European Union, the elites from Brussels, the German politicians who's also controlling kind of like the economy
EU, yeah.
of EU, and by extension affecting the economy of Hungary, for example. So he rode that kind of like disappointment, that
Right.
kind of like disillusionment, and now he is very successful because it's been, I think, 4 or even more successive elections that this has
Exactly.
continuously consolidated control of the Hungarian parliament and has maintained supermajority control. But there are recent developments, and this is probably something that many of us in the Philippines can learn from, right?
Right.
That once he has reached that supermajority and kind of like dominated Hungarian politics, if I'm not mistaken, uh, in the last elections, parang opposition is just concentrated in a few urban centers, but around Hungary, they
Yeah.
really poll well, they really poll strongly. But it has invited a different opposition. Now it's within the coalition of Fidesz,
Intra-cartel.
Intra, no? So it's like Marcos Duterte coalition.
They're learning from us.
Yeah. because the opposition has become so marginalized after successive
Yeah.
elections that their eyes are, they're turning against each other. They're competing. And now I think the next election will be in 2026. That's the direction that people are expecting, that Orban's biggest competition and threat would actually come from a original faction of
Is
his own
this
coalition.
is this faction more right-wing than him or more centrist than him?
So it's more center-right, the TISA party. It's more center-right, but I think the claim to, because if you look at the background of the people involved, they're actually quite far-right.
I'm wondering in terms of like, what are the issues with the status quo? Like, are they saying Orban is going too far? Orban is becoming too anti-EU? Is he, because as we speak, there are conversations about sanctions, right? EU withdrawing. I mean, people forget, like, you don't transition into EU just like that. It's not like ASEAN, you can just join by virtue of geography and history. There is the Copenhagen criteria, there's funding, there's support. And Hungary has been benefiting from billions of dollars of aid from the rest of Europe. And
Exactly. That's why many liberals and Democrats across the EU are saying that we are essentially subsidizing Orban's illiberal regime. And as
Right.
you've said, there are they have some good performance in some areas of their economy, and essentially that's also because they benefit a lot from European
Exactly.
subsidy, which he says is the evil and controlling and the enemy of the Hungarian people. So I think the current alignment or disalignment, if you will, has something to do with
Right.
the claim that there's so much corruption under Orban
Ah.
government. And this is not surprising given that they have consolidated control.
Yeah.
So there's practically like a mafia state.
Right.
Hungarian scholars would call it a mafia state. That they have control of key economic industries. And if you look at the newspapers, if you think that it's bad enough in the Philippines, if you look at the newspapers, there are times that the front pages cover the same things and cover and say the same issues. That's that's the concentration of power that
Right.
Orban has in Hungary. So one is corruption. The other is that he has become too anti-EU, and of course, I would imagine that certain segments of the coalition are
and too close to
anxious.
Putin, and too close to Putin or China. So
Yes.
that's what I'm saying. I can imagine that the other side is positioning itself as more moderate in the sense that, we don't want to be Putin-style regime, right? And this is where it's important to the Trump coalition, right? Because if you look at the Trump coalition, and as we speak, Trump is assembling his cabinet.
And Xi Jinping as well.
Yeah, exactly. So the thing is, we see many contradictory. So there are the more isolationist supporters of MAGA who want America to withdraw from international obligations and regime. There are the more hawkish elements who want more aggressive presence, especially here in Asia. There are people who are more anti-globalization, anti-Wall Street. And then, of course, you also have a lot of tycoons and oligarchs, including Elon Musk, who are very much are against regulation. So it's a Big Ten coalition that Trump has. Do you foresee, again, this is very speculative, but does the Hungarian case, not to mention the Filipino case we will discuss shortly, does it say something about the rifts that could emerge later on? I mean, not to mention, this is Donald Trump. I mean, he's going to fire people right and left soon. Do you get what I'm saying? Because I think there's a lot of defeatism among liberals and progressives. Like, it's over. I mean, it's going to be forget about trifecta. It could be a quad. Supreme Court is conservative. 3 of them alone are by Trump. The House is most likely going to the Republicans. Senate is within one. So, like, forget about it. U.S. is going to go down a different direction, right? Some even warned about fascism. But when you look at the case of Hungary, maybe, it's going to be much more complicated than shades of gray, right?
Yeah, and I think it has something to do with the inherent tensions in what populist politics is, right? Because populist politics is really quite centered on the populist leader, I mean, so they kind of like dominate the entire coalition. And that's a problem from time to time because, for example, the Republicans, now they're under Donald Trump's thumb. But it hasn't always been like that, right? There will be party diehards would say that that's not how we run, that this is not how we run the Republican Party. But for populist leaders, think, for example, like Rodrigo Duterte, Thaksin in Thailand, but also Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, for example, before, it really centers on what they want, right? And therefore,
very personalistic,
it's very personalistic and centered on their charisma. As leaders, and that could go well for them if everyone in the coalition is quite happy with that kind of setup.
Right.
But it's not sustainable because, because it's politics. It's impossible that they will always be 100% happy all the time. That one man is calling the shots, right? So you could imagine, for example, in the case of Orban, that he over time that he has consolidated control, he has expanded the coalition from businesses, different industries, right? That there will be conflicts of interest among those businesses, right? And I think that's the challenge, right? Kaya in many ways, a good populist leader or kind of like a more effective one would kind of just like maintain a small coalition, right?
Right.
How would I describe? Parang
don't overstretch.
It's like and it's like a coalition of the weak.
Yeah.
Like all yes men, just follow me. They don't have any careers outside, their relationship with me.
Loyalists.
Yeah, loyalists.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that's how the Dutertes coalition
was,
look like. But that's a very effective strategy, right? Because there won't be potential defectors that would just unravel this entire populist coalition.
Obviously, I mean, the age should be an issue. I mean, Silvio Berlusconi was able to launch comeback after comeback until it reached a point whereby he was not at his peak. And that's where, you have Salvini and Meloni and all of the more right-wing, younger generation, Brothers of Italy and all came up. I mean, that could be also a possibility, right? Kind of a Republican versions of Salvini and Meloni, and not to mention J.D. Vance could come out. Because he's going to be 80 years old soon. I mean, he's still very energetic, but, he's not at the halcyon days of his youth, if I can put it that way.
I was just seeing on social media that, there's some people who's saying that, Biden might run again in 2020.
Well, there's always stem cell. I mean, like, I'm not gonna say.
In many ways, because there are also there's also perspective, right, that democracy cannot really avoid populism, right? Because by design, right, because in a democracy you allow people to vote, right, and you kind of like aggregate the preferences of the majority. That by design, there's always going to be someone, some kind of like Trump, some kind of Duterte and Orban, who would come from somewhere, right, and take advantage of that design of democracy, right? Because after all, if you want to catch the attention of the majority, then you probably have to go populist style. That's why I think there is also an argument to be made here. Very influential populism scholar saying that the left or the Democrats, or the liberals probably also need a populist version of their leaders.
So it's the only game in town in terms of style,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And I've been hearing all this argument. Had Biden ran in 2016 and not blocked by Obama, essentially, had Bernie Sanders been allowed to, essentially channel the populist energy for a while, history could have turned out very differently. But some would argue that it's really Obama's fault because he was still insisting on a kind of an identity politics base, a representation, I'm all for representation and minorities having rights, but that came at the expense of dealing with other issues, more bread and butter issues, industrial policy issues, anti-globalization sentiments, among other things. Now, let's transition to our beloved Philippines, because it's not like we lack any drama here. To what degree do you think that I think disintegration is a mild way of putting it, this mini civil war, let's just put it, between the House of Marcos and House of Duterte, although Marcos is a complicating element in this narrative, to what degree is that a reflection of intra-cartel politics, as you see in the case of Hungary, when there's no really opposition, that you're just looking at each other, it's a matter of time, right? And there was a former Trump chief of staff said, like, the White House looked like a zoo without fence. If you put a lion and a tiger, blood is gonna spill sooner than later. To what degree do you think this was really kind of an intra-cartel competition? I'm sorry for using those kind of terms, or maybe not. But also, to what degree do you think this is also a reflection of hubris of an aging populist? Because, to be honest, I feel that Duterte, the father, the patriarch, kind of contributed to the acceleration of this process. I think him going all out, attacking Marcos, even personally, really didn't help the case and made it impossible for his daughter to play this game of, let's just kick the can down the road until this guy is the lame duck. And they could have played that game much longer. And I think this is where the aging factor for me is. Because anyone who knows Duterte in his 50s and 40s, obviously in our case, anecdotes, they would say he was much more dynamic and much more calibrated. And what they're seeing right now is not the sharpest version of Duterte. What is your read in that?
I think that the problem or the challenge of the populists is that their appeal rests primarily, of course, on their charisma, right? Yep. But there will come a point, like Duterte, that you would age, and some of the physical elements of your charisma you would lose, right? For example, it's always a popular populists always popularize that they are
macho,
but not only macho in the sense that macho also in bed, right? For example, that they're very sexually active, that they have a lot of women, right? That they have multiple sexual partners, right? But after some point, right, it would no longer be convincing if you can see that the old man cannot walk properly, right? Unaided by
cannot
others,
finish sentences like before.
So there's a limit to that, I think, and and it's about the physical limits of his bodies, right? There is so it's a matter of will this populist be able to reinvent themselves beyond like that traditional populist appeal, right? And that's hard to say because most of those, for example, most of those populist leaders who experience who age after some time, right? They just because it's effective. They didn't really innovate. They just wanted to just do whatever it is that worked for them in the past, right?
That's an important point because I don't want to pass judgment on Donald Trump Jr. or anyone else. I mean, the selection of J.D. Vance was passing down, the torch, right? The baton, right? The idea is that after Trump, he's going to carry MAGA to its next phase. Young, he's just 39 when he was 40, barely 40. So that's important, right? Passing down the baton. To what degree do you think that was a problem with Duterte's? Because, one version is that Sara Duterte is a poor copy of an originally problematic. You know what I'm saying? Because definitely Sara Duterte is still considered as one of the top contenders. We'll discuss that. For the top office down the road. She's still the vice president. She still has majority approval ratings. I think it would be foolish to dismiss her political capital. But I think it will be just as foolish also to deny the fact that she doesn't have the spontaneity the dexterity, and unfortunately also because, let's just be honest, there's also element of misogyny. She couldn't pull off the antics that her father pulls off, right? To what degree do you think that's also the problem with Duterte? That this passing down the baton is not happening effectively. There's no JD Vance for Duterte, if I
Yeah,
can put it that way. Yeah.
So yeah, in a sense, it's the problem of like populist successors, right? And it's hard to get successors when the whole point of your politics is really charisma, right? As you've said, and as we've all seen, right? If the vice president is, if Vice President Sara, for example, is making a joke that she will, she will kill or behead the president, right? It's actually scary if you if you look at her, if you see
The
video,
delivery
right?
was not funny. I think Duterte could have put, the father could have said it, and then he'll say something, and then you laugh.
Exactly.
There was no laughter. It was like,
Yeah.
oh, okay.
Yeah, and and in I think populists are also kind of like described as your I mean sexiest uncle in dinner parties, but they're also kind of like funny, and that's why it works, right? Even though their
The
politics
awkward uncle.
is bad, they're quite entertaining.
Yeah.
Diba? Parang,
And this one is not very, very entertaining.
yes,
Yeah.
and I think there's also a sex component into it, right? That
Misogyny, yeah.
it's hard for women. So I'm thinking, for example, of Marie Le Pen, for example, that it's
Right.
actually hard for women to kind of like perform also this
Or
populist
Kirchner, the
politics
wife, yeah.
because of the traditional expectations on what women and men are, right? So if and it's very awkward on Sarah, right? She's kind of like going from the leftmost to the rightmost. Sometimes she wants to portray that she's very motherly and kind of like caring,
Yes.
right? Would appear somewhere in Baclaran, right?
But that's hard to reconcile with her smacking someone. It's like,
Yeah.
say like
Yes.
immediately they'll put that picture. It's not gonna work.
Yeah, and then the
It's not
pendulum
gonna work.
would swing the other way, and she
Yeah.
will be like, she wants to sound this very strong, like
Scary,
Tatay Digong
yeah,
type, but it
yeah.
appears too scary
Yes.
and not.
Where's the humor? Like, where's the punchline? Like, that's the thing. Like, you're waiting for the, and then there's no punch. Oh, okay, that's different, right? And we had a guest here. We had Congressman Zia here, also here, and he also pointed out something very important. He said, essentially, was saying, if you're a president, you can get away with a lot, especially if you're a male president. If you're a vice president and not male, your room for mistake is, the margin is not the same. And I said, actually, you have to be fair also to Sarah. She doesn't have the same power. She's not, obviously, there's always the element of misogyny. So I think it's really a difficult position for Sarah, if you can put it that way, right? And speaking of difficult position, this midterms is not looking very good for the Duterte camp, is it? Like, it looks like a very asymmetrical competition. I mean, people talk as if we were talking about two equally powerful dynasties. But if you look at it, none of the Dutertes felt competitive enough to run for Senate. In fact, they felt so threatened that, one son was bumped down to vice mayor. The father said, I'll take care of this, lest, the Nograleses will take over. And then the other son, I don't know, he may even lose the congressional race as the Nograleses, double down on their momentum. What is your read of that?
Right, and we also have to remember that during the time that the Duterte administration was in power, that they were able to sideline the faction of, for example, June Evasco, who was
Right.
insistent that we need to build an organization so that our power could endure and our influence could endure.
Just to be clear, June Vasco, for those people who forgot about him, because he got immediately sidelined by
Yes.
Bongo and all.
Yes.
He was the campaign manager genius guy, and he had this kind of a Stockholm syndrome dynamic. Like, I think he was like on the other side of things in Davao, and they came to. So he had this very kind of a organic, grassroots-driven,
Yeah.
intelligent campaign,
and
right?
this is his proposal is actually, he was trying to organize this kilusang pagbabago. I
Movement,
think
yeah.
he was trying to look at, for example, like the Bolivarian circles of
Chavismo. Yeah, Chavismo,
Chavez,
yeah.
right? That it will make sure that you have grassroots support, you have organized grassroots support, and that it can defend, right, the Duterte faction. But because he was sidelined so early, and they bought the other model, which is the
just cut
Bongo
a deal
model,
with
which
the-
is just
yeah.
the traditional Philippine politics, if you will, right? By 2019, by their midterm elections, they were already performing poorly in local elections. They weren't really able to build
Did
enough.
June Vasco even win?
No.
No, exactly. That's what I'm saying. Even Lavinia, one of the social media managers,
I think
that's a good point.
Sara's hugpong ng pagbabago, even in Mindanao,
In Davao, even they were lost, right?
it didn't perform that well, right? So I think it's a preview of their
Interesting.
current situation that they weren't really able to. Of course, at that time, it appears that they were able to consolidate political power, but they didn't. They didn't do it formally, structurally, or organizationally. Right? It was very. It was
Spontaneous,
transactional,
transactional,
spontaneous, right? And look at these people now, right? They've turned they're on the other side, right? So if you look at it that way and kind of like look at what's happening now, the Dutertes are on their own, right? They have some allies here and there.
And some base in Davao, but I mean, again, we'll talk about this towards the end of this conference, the whole Vismin. That's always a constituency they can potentially tap, unless they're up against someone also with Vismin background. I want to ask you, because I noticed even in our academic circles, this didn't come up as much. Structurally, were there enough conditions for the Chavismo option to work? Because some would argue that the June Evasco model would work in election period, but to sustain it throughout the years, that meant babanggan mo lahat ng mga warlords and all, and that would have triggered a huge backlash. But at the same time, part of me is thinking, interesting, Duterte was also about opening up possibilities, right? I mean, under Duterte, we saw that a president can openly attack the biggest businessmen, right? And he kind of got away with it. We're not saying it's okay. He was a president who kind of emphasized the secular nature of our state by taking on the religious institutions on the issue of contraceptives. Again, none of this is saying that Duterte was a good populist. I'm just saying he showed the coordinates of power if you're really willing to go to the next level, right? But do you think he could have gone all the way to build a kind of a Chavismo grassroots-based model? Because he had 90% approval. Everyone was scared to be put on his narco list. In theory, he could have, right?
I think it would have been possible. I think the nearest model would be Taksin's Puwatay Party,
kind of a red movement,
the red shirt movements, right? And it's the same. It's the same kind of like, there are similarities. It's very clientelistic. You have local warlords, local election bosses, right? But he was able to kind of like co-opt some, but also neutralize the others. And if you will look back at what the Dutertes did in 2019 local elections, there were some areas that they kind of like focus and allocated attention, right? So you look at, for example, Cebu City, for example, right? And during that election season, put Davao police in Cebu City, but also in regional police command, right? And the result of that, and I did research on this, is that the result of that is that it was hard for the non-Duterte candidates to move their money around. And they couldn't activate the traditional election machines because the police were literally, they literally set up checkpoints outside their party headquarters, their own residential houses. So I think it could have been it would have been possible. That's what I'm saying, right? If you have if you have the machinery of the state and the popularity of Digong
and the narco list that you could use as a leash, that was very powerful. That was very powerful.
But I don't think they had the vision because, again, the Gianevasco model was already rejected. And if just looking at Duterte and how he managed the pandemic and these nightly press conferences, I don't think he had the vision to be able to build that.
And also probably he just didn't have the, forget about acumen, the wherewithal, if I can put it that. Now, towards the last part of our conversation today, I mean, obviously, we hope to continue this conversation as the elections come. But as we head towards the midterm elections, what is the lay of the land right now? Are you expecting, as usual, this will be a very strong pro-incumbency performance, especially at the local level? But having said that, the Senate race looks like a complete... Think of all the... Like, this is the most number of candidates, right? I have vlogger friends who are running for Senate. Like, this is the most congested race.
When are you running?
We'll talk about that after this year. What's going on here? Is this exceptional midterm elections? In what ways is it unique, and what are the things that we have to watch out for?
Yeah, I think the lay of the land is that, as you know, it's the talk of the town, right? The house of Marcos and Duterte is in a civil war, right?
Yeah.
And therefore more opportunities for everyone, right? That's one way to look at it, because if the Uniteam coalition was still alive and they went into the 2025 midterms together, uh, it wouldn't matter, you know, how popular you are. If you're going against that coalition, it would be
Yeah.
very difficult, right?
Very difficult.
Especially at the national level, right?
Yeah.
So now it's quite open, right? Because there's a possibility, mathematically wise, numbers wise, that okay, those who will be supported by Marcos and the Malacanang, definitely 100% advantage, right? In it's Marcos, but also the resources of Malacanang, right?
Yeah.
But there's also alternative sources of kind of like political support, and that would be the endorsement, for example, from the Dutertes. And you're right, they are experiencing decline in popular support, but not in all places.
Right.
They're really quite solid still in Mindanao, and in fact, their national average are still, you know, it's not declining as fast as it would have been if Mindanao kind of like already left the Dutertes. So because Mindanao is still holding on to the Dutertes, then you know they can still project
Yeah, they have the
nationally.
captured constituency, yeah. And in the same way, that captured constituency turned against the administration. Marcos' biggest reason for plunge is his numbers are like what? He has like a 30% barely approval
Yeah,
rating.
yeah.
No Filipino president has that. This
And-
is crazy.
And it's going to be kind of like the same in the sense that, you know, in Metro Manila, if you look at NCR, if you look at
Right.
North Luzon, Sara is so unpopular.
Oh yeah, she's a no-go zone in solid north. I am from the north, right? It's like the things they say in Ilocano, like, oh my God, don't be. I mean, like, even I like, let's be nice.
Yeah.
Let's not go down this road, mga kapsad.
Yeah.
Let's not do
But
that.
you can
yeah.
also say the same thing for
Good luck
Bongbong
going- yeah.
in
Mindanao,
Mindanao, right?
yeah.
I mean, I've seen that they're kind of like giving more ayudas in Mindanao because they really know that their numbers have taken a hit in that
Really
part
bad, yeah.
of the Philippines. But that means, as I've said, that we return to that usual dynamic of it's about plurality.
Yeah.
You get a bit of Luzon, you get a bit of Metro Manila, and maybe some votes in Mindanao, you're gonna win, right?
Yeah.
So because when they were together, you have to really just, you know, because they have the North and the South, then that alliance is quite formidable numbers-wise. That's why it's also, and interestingly, you see, for example, traditional opposition senators like Bamakino, kind of like moving up in the Senate race,
Yeah.
right? And two things. One is that, of course, numbers are divided. There's a space for a third force. But also, I think, discourse-wise, rhetorics-wise, if the Marcoses and the Dutertes are kind of like fighting against each other, the opposition is not being talked about that
Yeah.
much, then they're kind of like in a safe place, right?
Mm.
They're not being attacked.
Right.
They're not.
Mm.
Yeah.
So last part, I want to discuss this. So what is the lay of the land for the genuine opposition, if I can use that term? Because Dutertes are de facto opposition, functional opposition because of power play. But the genuine opposition, 2025 looks very difficult in the Senate, just mathematically speaking. There are just so many candidates, and all the big families are there. I won't be surprised some of the 2 or 3 big names won't even make it. So opposition not making it to Magic 12 is not necessarily the worst thing because it's just too competitive. But looking at 2028, because you know by 2026, 2027, if there's no constitutional change, nothing outside the box, Marcos is going to be lame duck by that time. Probably even a very unpopular president if the inflation situation, cost of living. How important it is for the genuine opposition to get its act together this time, because unlike in 2022, it looks like there's no longer that agglomeration, that grand coalition of solid North and solid South. To be fair, I mean, Lenny getting 15 million votes in that situation was almost a miracle. I mean, it's incredible how far Lenny came. Obviously, I've been among some people who felt there could have been more done to sustain that movement, but can you see a kind of a pink movement 2.0? A kind of a reconsolidated version of, hey, are we going to be just defined by these 2 families? Do you think that's possible? What are the elements that have to come together for that to be a possibility?
You know, I think just like the Duterte story, the pink movement, as you know, there should have been an opportunity to build an enduring kind of like, if not a party, kind of like a movement, right?
It's okay. I'm not putting you in trouble.
No.
It's okay.
But I think that they've let it go, right?
Yeah.
It's unclear whether they still want to lead the entire pink movement. To
I mean,
a
Bam is
particular-
wearing pink more now,
to,
right? Which is what I've been saying. Like, they have to wear the pink more because, you know.
Right, but obviously, it's really the former Vice President Leni Robredo who's seen by the public as the leader of this pink movement.
Right.
So if she's also going local and kind of like not really actively shepherding this entire movement, right? So they probably won't be able to really maximize the potential of that pink movement. But also, I think that for the opposition, as you've said, that Senate race is really crowded, so they're kind of like experimenting.
Yeah.
Some are going party list, right? There are some local positions that they're also entering, and it's good that we are experimenting because it looks like that it looks like that this particular election is not really going to be easy, not only for the genuine opposition, but actually anyone who's not part of the traditional
Administration,
political
machine,
dynasties, right? I mean, the Tulfos, for example, is the two Tulfos polling really well is actually in a sea of all these dynastic families, but they're also trying to become a dynastic powerhouse, right? That in itself is like that in itself is the current landscape. It's a very crowded. Senate,
But
right?
the power of the Tulfos is also a reflection of the potency of the populist brand, right? They're a different version, the non-EJK version, but still the macho version, the let's get things done version. How big is a chance that there'll be also a populist comeback in 2020? If not Duterte, if not Tulfo, some sort of a strong leader. I mean, the reason I keep on saying this is because I think there are clear lessons from Trump.
Yeah.
A year earlier, I mean, from now, Trump was seen as, forget about it. It's DeSantis, Nikki Haley, Trump. Oh my God, it's too much. I don't think. And now where we are, biggest comeback, greatest comeback in human history. So they can go through a hibernation and then come back with a vengeance, right? That's very possible.
Yeah, and I think for the House of Marcos, for example, the biggest problem is not this 2025, but really 2028, because they don't have a clear successor.
Yeah.
Unlike the Dutertes, I mean, Sara is always a viable
That's true.
candidate for their faction, right? And if you look at the polling numbers, for example, Sara's nearest opponent is Tulfo. It's not any of the people identified with the Marcos faction, right?
It's essentially a 30-30 split, right? Yeah.
And it would be interesting in a landscape like that if you have kind of like two flavors of populist politics, right?
Yeah.
Going against each other, for populism versus populism, is what kind of space is there for opposition, for example, for
Right.
liberal politics, for other kinds of like maybe leftist opposition even, right? But I think if you look at past election records, it's a good thing for any alternative politician because it's easier to win if there are two viable candidates, right? It's just just a plurality of votes
Yeah.
would make you president rather than them consolidating in just one
As we saw in
candidate, for example.
2022. Beautiful. Thank you very much. That was a comprehensive and fascinating discussion. Looking forward to more of this in the coming months and years, I suppose, because it's always going to be exciting in the Philippines. Catch us again next week here on One News. You can also check out the long conversation on Spotify and YouTube. I'm Richard Heydarian, and that was The View from Manila. We're One News, all sides, all the time.